And still on federal politics, our guests tonight in the studio are Labor's Maxine McKew, the Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. And to argue the Liberal Party's case is Malcolm Turnbull, the member for Wentworth. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Lee.
Malcolm Turnbull, on Saturday you tweeted the words of the French political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville. Events can move from the impossible to the inevitable without stopping at the probable. What were you alluding to there?
Well, nothing in particular, really, but I was really...
Not hinting at a coalition election victory?
No, not really. People read that into it, but you shouldn't read too much into my tweets. I was reading a very interesting article in the New York Times, actually, about climate change and changes in climate change policy, which quoted that great line of de Tocqueville, probably the keenest commentator ever on American politics. 1830s was when he did his work.
On the weekend, when you sent that tweet, it was on the day where some very favourable polls, or a very favourable poll, had come out for the coalition. Since then, though, commentators are saying that perhaps Julia Gillard has regained some momentum and that Tony Abbott has peaked.
Well, I'm a retired commentator. I stopped being a political correspondent many, many years ago, and I'll leave it to you and the other political commentators. This is going to be a very tight election. It is very winnable. For both sides, and we're working very, very hard to win this election and restore to Australia the quality and the calibre of government that it deserves.
Would you concede that the coalition is in an election-winning position now because it decided not to back the Labor government on the emissions trading scheme?
Look, I think I wouldn't concede. I would say that it's a winnable election. So yes, we can win.
But you don't necessarily see that as the reason why the coalition's got to this position?
I think the emissions trading scheme was incredibly significant, but for a different reason. When Kevin Rudd abandoned it, he demonstrated that he was a man who led a government that lacked the courage of its own convictions. You see, in politics you can be forgiven up to a point, and I think this government has stretched that point, for a degree of incompetence. But if you are seen to be hollow, if you're seen to have no heart, to believe in nothing, and that's what Kevin Rudd did. I mean, tragically for him, because he went to the 2007 election, and Maxine remembers it well, and he said, climate change is the greatest moral challenge of our times. We're going to answer that with an emissions trading scheme, which, of course, was our policy in the 2007 election as well. But that was his policy response. And then when the coalition changed its policy, instead of saying, OK, I've got a mandate for this, I'm going to the people, I'm going to have a double dissolution, he lost his nerve and walked away from it. And from that point, his support in the community, in the opinion polls, as evidenced in the opinion polls, crashed because he was seen to be lacking in conviction. Well, and that's what you can't be forgiven for.
Let me pick up on that, because tonight at this community event in Rooty Hill, there has been some obvious cynicism from the crowd towards Labor and a seeming issue with whether they can trust Labor given everything that's happened. Maxine McKew, is it a case that Labor has brought it on itself, as Malcolm Turnbull would suggest?
Well, a couple of things. I agree with Malcolm that this is an incredibly tight election. It feels tight across the nation to me, and it certainly feels tight, in my area in Bennelong. I'm on a very tight margin, 1.4%, so I take nothing for granted. But I go back to Malcolm's point. Malcolm, you failed to take your party with you. If you were leading the Liberal Party today, we'd be on track to bring in an emissions trading system.
If John Howard had won the 2007 election, we'd probably have an emissions trading scheme.
Yeah, this is, the great tragedy.
Full of ironies, all this.
We had a string of tragedies, really. In the run-up to Copenhagen. You lost the leadership, you couldn't hold your party on that. I think that's a great pity. We then had the disappointment of Copenhagen, and the politics changed substantially.
But Maxine McKew, a lot's happened since then. You dumped the Prime Minister since then.
And I would say the disappointment, certainly when the decision was made to defer it, the disappointment was registered immediately in my electorate, and I made that clear. I talked about that with Kevin and others in my party. Now, I think the important thing is, as Julia has said now, we have to rebuild that consensus.
You've only got about 10 days, though.
Well, no, I think we've got a clear position there. It's certainly my view that, like Malcolm's, it is inevitable we will see change on this. It is inevitable we will see a price on carbon. Many of the big companies are already factoring this in to their business plans, but we do have to rebuild a consensus. I mean, it was very interesting, and you probably agree with this, Malcolm. I had climate change as a significant issue in my part of northwest Sydney. People want action on it, but I have to say, when the details of the CPRS were laid out, it was still very contentious. It was very contentious with our first package and then the amended package that we negotiated with you when you were leader.
Let me ask, if I can, about a policy that Labor has announced today, which is this joint project with the New South Wales State Labor Government to build the Chatswood-Parramatta rail link, which has been announced and re-announced over the past 12 years. Maxine McKew, is this not a